Hello, everyone. It's me, it's Lauren, and I am here for, is it day 4 of, what are we doing today? We're doing our Titanic, I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic read aloud. I think we're all the way up through chapter 6, so I'm going to read chapters 7 and 8 today. But first, I have a couple things I want to tell you. First, I want to do some shout outs to Beckett, Ramon, Craig, and Emma. It was great to hear from you guys. I also wanted to just give you a quick little bit of, I wanted to take you a little bit behind the scenes into how I wrote I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, because it was a little different than a lot of my other I Survived books. I do a ton of research for all of those books. You know, I read, I interview experts, I study videos and maps and go to museums. But my favorite thing to do is to travel to the place that I'm writing about. So if I'm writing about the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State, I want to go there. If I'm writing about Hurricane Katrina that happened in New Orleans, I want to go there. I've traveled to almost every single place that I've written about in the I Survived series, except, of course, I wasn't on the Titanic. I'm quite old, but not that old. And the wreckage of the Titanic is 3 miles down. I think it's 3 miles. You guys can check that. Resting on the floor of the North Atlantic Ocean. So it's underwater, and people have explored it, but they have to use these very special submarines, and I don't think many people have had the chance to actually go. So when I was writing about the George and Daisy and Phoebe and Marco and Enzo, my characters from the Titanic book, and trying to imagine their journey on the ship, I relied on a lot of different sources. I read a lot of books. Actually, the movie Titanic, which is directed by a guy named Jim Cameron, it was an amazing research source because Jim Cameron became one of the big experts in the Titanic. So pretty much every detail you see in that movie about the ship is accurate. I have tons of Titanic books that also help me, and I wanted to share with you my very favorite one. It's so heavy, it's like a brick, and I actually ordered it from England when I was writing this book 10 years ago. And what was cool about it was this is actually a book that includes blueprints, actual plans that the builders of the Titanic used. And it includes, so every little detail of the ship, like the anchor, the lifeboats, the lights, there's details about them, and they have, drawings and then photographs. So when I was writing the book and I was describing George's journey, onto down to third class, or trying to imagine, what it was like for him to walk through the hallways, this book was such an amazing resource for me. So I thought you might like to see it. So when we last left off at the end of chapter 6, George was about to go on a big adventure. He had heard from a man named Mr. Stead, who had stopped by the table where George and Aunt Daisy and Phoebe were having dinner. This man stopped by and made an intriguing comment that got George thinking about the fact that someone had brought a mummy onto the Titanic, and that this mummy was in a crate in the first class baggage hold. So I will tell you that is based on, on something that I read. My books are historical fiction, which means that all of the facts are true, and then I make up details about the characters. But Mr. Stead was a man who was really on the Titanic, and there was a rumor that there had been a mummy on the ship, and people at that time, it was really terrible, would go to these archaeological sites, and they were allowed to buy mummies and bring them back to New York and have these parties where they and their friends would, open up the tombs and look at these mummies, which sounds just terrible. And of course, we would never do that today. But okay, so let's start reading. I've just been talking and talking to you. I really wish I could just tell you everything about what I learned about the Titanic. Chapter 7. Just thinking about seeing the mummy made George happy. He went down 5 flights of stairs to G deck and practically skipped along the long hallway toward the front of the ship. He ducked into doorways a few times to hide from the night stewards, but he had no trouble finding his way, not like Phoebe, who got lost walking from the dining room to the washroom. Next time, I'll leave a trail of breadcrumbs like Hansel and Gretel, Phoebe had said on their first day on board. What about lemon drops, George had suggested. Phoebe had giggled. The hold was in the very front of the ship, past the mail sorting room and the cabins where the stokers and the firemen stayed. Too bad, George thought, that there wasn't time to sneak in and see the escape ladders. Luckily, they had 2 more days at sea. George walked right through the doors of the first-class baggage room and down a steep metal staircase that led to the hold. All around him were crates and trunks and bags neatly stacked on shelves and lined up on the floor. It took him a minute to figure out that everything was arranged in alphabetical order by the owners' names, and it took him only a few minutes to find the B's. And there it was, a plain wooden crate stamped with the words, Mr. David Burrow, New York City, contents fragile. George smiled to himself. This was going to be so easy. He took out his knife and started to pry off the lid of the crate. He worked carefully, prying each nail loose so he'd be able to close the crate tight again when he was finished. He made it halfway around when he heard a strange sound. The hair on his arms prickled. It was the same feeling he'd had the night of the panther, that someone or something was watching him. George stared at the crate, his heart pounding, and before he could even take a breath, something leapt out of the shadows and pushed him to the ground. George looked up, half expecting to see a mummy rising out of the crate, her arms reaching for George's throat. What he saw was almost as horrifying. It was a man with blue eyes and a scar running down the side of his face. He grabbed George's knife out of his hand. The man was small but very strong. "I'll take this," he said, admiring the knife. Then he looked George up and down. "So," the man said, "trying to fill your pockets with some first-class loot?" George realized he must be a robber. George had caught him in the act. No, the man pointed to George's boots. "Which trunk did you steal those from? Cost more than a third-class ticket, I'd say." George shook his head. I got them in London," he said, and too late realized he'd made a mistake by saying that. "Ah," the man said, "a prince from first class. Just down here for a little thrill. What's your name?" "George," George said softly. "Prince George," the man said, bowing in a joking way. "I'll pity those boots wouldn't fit me," he added, standing up. "But you do have something I would like. Your key. Always wanted to see one of those first-class cabins." There was no way George could let this man up to his suite. He'd jump overboard before he'd let him near Aunt Daisy or Phoebe. "There's a mummy down there," George blurted out. It's worth millions. It's in the crate." The man raised an eyebrow. George kept talking. I thought I could sneak it off the ship and sell it in New York," George lied. "My father's business is bad. I thought if I could sell it." The man looked at the crate. "I like the way you think," he said. He waved George's knife at him and told him not to move. Then he quickly worked the knife around the lid of the crate. Obviously, he'd done this many times. He lifted off the lid, but before either of them could look inside, there was a tremendous rumbling noise, and the entire hold began to shake so hard that George almost fell. The shaking got stronger and stronger, the noise louder and louder, like thunder exploding all around them. A trunk tumbled off a shelf and hit the scar-faced man in the head. The knife clattered to the floor, but George didn't try to get it. Here was his chance to escape. He spun around, ran up the stairs, and darted out the door. So that's the end of the chapter. Okay, chapter 8. George ran as fast as he could down the hall. He heard shouting behind him, but he didn't stop until he was back on B deck, safe again in first class. A steward hurried past him with a stack of clean towels. "Good evening, sir," he said. George nodded, out of breath. Nothing could happen to him up here, he knew. So why was his heart still pounding? It was the ship, he realized. That thundering noise, that shaking he'd heard in the first-class hold. Had a boiler exploded? Had a steam pipe burst? An eerie silence surrounded him, and George's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the engines had been turned off. The quiet rumbling of the ship had stopped. Just outside, George heard people talking loudly. Did they know what was happening? George went out onto the deck and walked over to a small crowd of men. Most were still dressed in their dinner tuxedos and puffing on cigars. They were standing at the rail, pointing and laughing at something happening on the well deck 1 level below. What was so funny? George squeezed between the two men and looked over the rail. At first he was sure his eyes were playing tricks. It looked like the well deck had been through a winter storm. It was covered with ice and slush. A bunch of young men in tattered coats and hats were pelting each other with balls of ice, roaring with laughter like kids having a snowball fight. "What's happened?" asked a man who walked up behind George. "The ship nudged an iceberg," said an old man with a bushy mustache. He didn't sound worried. "An iceberg? Is that why they've stopped the engine?" said the new man. "Because some ice is on the deck?" "Just being cautious, it seems, following regulations," said the older fellow. "I spoke to one of the officers. He assured me we'll be underway any moment." "Hey there," he yelled down to the young man below. "Toss some of that ice up here." One of the kids picked up a piece of ice the size of a baseball. He threw it, but the man with the bushy mustache missed. George reached out and made a clean catch with one hand. The crowd cheered. George held up his ice and smiled. Then he held it out to the man. "Keep it, son," the man said. "There's plenty for everyone." The piece of ice was heavier than George had expected. He sniffed it and wrinkled his nose. It smelled like old sardines. More balls of ice came sailing up from below, and the men jostled to catch them. Their laughter and cheers rose up around George, and the fear he'd felt in the baggage hold faded away. From up here, on the deck of this incredible ship, George felt powerful. Nothing could hurt him on the Titanic. Not a meteor falling from space, not a giant squid, not the scar-faced man. George squinted into the distance, hoping to see the iceberg, but the sea faded into darkness. His teeth were chattering now. It was so much colder than it had been at dinner time. He wanted to be back in bed, curled up under his fancy first-class sheets and blankets. The hallway was quiet as George crept back towards his suite. As he was letting himself in, he stepped on something that made a crunching sound under his boot. At first, George thought it was ice or a piece of glass, but when he picked up his heel, he saw that the carpet was covered with yellow crystals. George smiled. It was just one of Phoebe's lemon drops. George let himself in, easing the door shut. Phoebe's bed curtains were closed. The light under Aunt Daisy's door was off. George quickly changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed. Yes, he was safe, he told himself. He tried to go to sleep, but as the minutes ticked by, his mind got restless. It hit him that his knife was gone forever, and the total silence of the ship seemed to press down on him. Why hadn't the engine started up again? He lay awake, listening and wondering. It was almost a relief when he heard someone knocking at the door. All right, everyone. Great to be with you today. I will be back here tomorrow to read the next 2 chapters. If you have any questions, have your mom or dad or whoever's watching out for you get in touch with me. And I hope you have a fantastic day. Wish I was with you all. Bye-bye.